respect those who do come on time. We were trying to give some time for the others to show up, but I think we should get started. Very good afternoon to all of you. Thank you for coming to this roundtable on sustainability, finance, and technology. It's a series that we started last year, but we're trying to kind of pick up the momentum on it, and we hope to bring in senior academics, researchers, as well as people from industry or from government who could address these roundtables on different issues that animate discussions within India. I'm no better person than Professor Sanjoy Banerjee, who's come here from all the way from the City University of New York. But before I introduce Professor Banerjee, let me just say something along the lines of being optimistic. About 24 hours ago, we got the news about the conclusion of the Durban Conference of the Parties. I have kind of stopped going to the COPs, not because I don't believe in multilateralism, but I think there's a lot more that is happening on the ground that we need to start focusing on energies towards. And that's partly what the Council on Energy, Environment and Water tries to do, integrate these three areas, energy, environment, water, and work not only on the research side as a research think tank, but work very closely with government and with industry partners to see how we can facilitate more investments, more action on sustainable technologies, whether it's in the energy space, in the water space, or in the environment space. We are very fortunate here to have some participants from the solar industry in particular. Mr. Srivastava, thank you very much for coming. We held a consultation on the National Solar Mission on Friday, just 3 days ago, which was an excellent discussion, and we are analyzing that mission. The brochures in front of you give you an overview of the kind of work we've been doing, and that the table at the back has a few of our publications, but there's a lot more on our website. So with that sense of optimism, that the fact that we can still have people in the room when certainly the rooms that are more filled up, the COPs, don't get much work done, I think suggests that this is where we need to start focusing our discussions. And we have today with us Professor Sanjoy Banerjee, who is, in a sense, he's going to give a lecture series actually today and tomorrow. Today's talk is going to be focused on sort of sustainable energy futures. What does the technology horizon look like? And with a little bit more focus on energy storage, and I'll come to that in a second. And tomorrow I should also flag the event up. It's going to be a lecture upstairs in the WWF auditorium on safety of nuclear reactors. Professor Banerjee is exactly the kind of person I look for when I try to look out for researchers that could join our organization. It's classic multidisciplinary, multi-domain expert with decades of experience. Professor Banerjee is currently Distinguished Professor of Chemical Engineering and Director of the City University of New York's Energy Institute, which he set up in 2008. And prior to that, he spent 28 years as professor at the University of California in Santa Barbara. Prior to that, he was with the McMaster University in Canada, with the University of California at Berkeley, with Atomic Energy of Canada. He is a member of the U.S. Advisory Committee on Reactor Safeguards, and he has also helped set up several companies which deal with parallelizable software, artificial intelligence techniques to deal with system software, gas reaction technologies, and so forth. Why do we want to discuss energy futures and energy storage? Since the 1950s, I think it was it was President Eisenhower who first used the phrase energy security and independence. Since then, every single American president has promised energy security and independence in their campaigns. It's increasingly an issue that animates our discussions as an emerging economy with increasing energy demand. The problem is when you convert energy into the form of electricity, it's the worst form to kind of store. The grid is something where at every moment the energy production has to equal energy consumption. And that's where this issue of the viability and future of renewable energies comes in. How do we promote renewable energies while we are competing with other energy sources, not just because other energy sources are fossil fuel based, but because they can be stored before they're converted into electricity, whereas we can't do the same with renewable energies. What kind of new technologies are on the horizon? How do we commercialize those technologies? That's kind of range of questions we've given to Dr. Banerjee as part of this brief. And I've spoken enough. Now over to him. Thank you very much for coming over.
Thank you, Dr. Rocha. First, let me say it's a great honor and a pleasure to speak and have a conversation with you. I should speak louder in this room.
Is that fine?
Can you hear me at the back?
Yes.
Okay. I thought that it would be interesting to talk about sustainable energy futures, but my personal interest in this business is primarily on energy storage, and specifically on batteries, very large-scale, grid-scale batteries. I'll sort of lead up to that, but I won't get into too many details about it, but hopefully in the question-answer session, whatever we have to discuss on this, we can bring up. So without further ado, the CUNY Energy Institute, if you like, is an institute which was set up about 4 years ago. Covers, of course, several sectors. Oil, gas is a major activity, nuclear power, and also in the renewable sector, energy storage. So that just gives you some background as to where we are. Let me show you the next slide. This is a very busy slide which you probably can't see from the back. But
use the lights. Is it? Can you see this clearly? We could dim some of the lights actually. Meena?
Yes, fine.
Dim some of the lights at this end.
I'll just, it's only there for illustrative purposes, but it's to show you that about 80% of the energy used in the United States, and probably similarly here, is from fossil fuels. Petroleum accounts, this is the petroleum, and it accounts for the largest amount of energy use in the transportation sector, which is remarkably inefficient. If you look at this, this is the only usable energy that comes out of the petroleum sector. This is all wasted energy. So we use oil particularly inefficiently. And there's a small amount that goes into industrial use, which is a little bit more efficient. But by far the biggest problem that the US faces is with regard to the petroleum part. 2/3 of our petroleum in the US is imported, and 2/3 roughly of it is used for transportation. So it's extremely difficult, and this is sort of the key problem of what to do with the imports, which is key to energy security. As Dr. Ghosh pointed out, our whole energy policy, of course, is sort of related to trying to reduce these petroleum imports to the maximum extent possible. Biomass is very little in use, primarily directly by burning stuff. Coal is a large domestic resource, and of course it's primarily used for power production. Natural gas is a major resource, it's a major domestic resource, and increasingly the US economy is becoming natural gas focused. Let me say one thing, digress a little bit. Natural gas in the US is currently selling at $4 to $5 a million cubic feet, whereas in Europe it sells roughly at $9 a million cubic feet. So the differential is very large. and it's unlikely that that can be maintained. So you can see that the issues with natural gas also are going to be to use it more efficiently, because this particular scenario cannot really endure for a very long time. Already every investor is building LNG facilities so that you can export it to some other place, and to just make LNG and export it is better than burning it at $4 a million cubic feet. To give you another idea about natural gas, there is, even in New York State, something like 50 years of New York State's natural gas usage just in the recoverable shale, which is shale gas. So there's been a huge production recently by innovative techniques of natural gas using hydraulic fracturing, horizontal wells, and probably this is a sort of area which will become very important in the rest of the world as well. In any case, this is to show you that natural gas is used in all sectors, industrial and so on, and for electricity generation. The message you will get later from me is it's very, very hard to compete with natural gas. Okay. And then there are these small amounts of power which are generated by nuclear. Well, actually, nuclear doesn't generate such a small amount. It's about 20% of the electricity in the US is nuclear. And hydro, wind and solar are very minor, as is geothermal. So that's our power mix. The majority is fossil, and with nuclear playing a major role. That's the only real game in town. Next. Just wanted to show you, though, the carbon dioxide production, which may or may not be important, but there is a lot of discussion about it. And scientists think that in the long term, this is something that can't be sustained. So it sort of enters the sustainability equation. Much of it comes from either transportation, because of burning petroleum, or from use of coal. If you look at the streams there, the thickness of this stream and the thickness of that stream, it's primarily coming from burning coal or from transportation. Natural gas is much more efficient in terms of producing carbon dioxide. It produces maybe half or less than coal. So in a long-term view of a sustainable environment in which carbon dioxide production is reduced, all the renewables which produce very little carbon dioxide, nuclear which produces none, and natural gas must enter the equation in some way. So next slide. This was just to show you that main energy growth is going to happen in non-OECD Asia in the future. So, but that was just informational. Next slide, please. So, oops, this is one of those horrible things. Keep going. Just till it comes to an end. Okay. The idea then, in summary, of a sustainable future might be a mix of wind, solar, nuclear, natural gas, and later on I will speak about coal, perhaps with some sort of carbon sequestration, because you can do that at power plants, and some form of storage, intermediate. This is just an idea. And then using the grid where it exists to transmit the energy, which ultimately gets used for transportation and appliances and industry. Now, you might think that that's almost an obvious thing to do, because you have an existing transmission distribution network in the grid, at least in the US. It's a different situation perhaps here, where you need more local and autonomous subgrids. Nonetheless, that wasn't the idea under the Bush administration. the Bush administration had replaced this sort of storage system with hydrogen. So the idea was to generate hydrogen, store the hydrogen, transmit it over hydrogen networks, and then use it locally, and including for transportation. That turned out to be a very difficult proposition because, first of all, transmission of hydrogen would require a whole new network. Secondly, distribution and use, whether it be in a car or so, or in other sort of transportation sector uses, is also very difficult. So when you took all that into account, this plan was not feasible. And towards the end of the Bush administration, there came a realization that we really had to look at energy storage or electricity storage as a key technology. So there's been a huge amount of work done since that time to try and bring electricity storage so the grid is not a just-in-time system where the production exactly has to balance the consumption, as Dr. Bush said. That is really something where we have to move out of, okay, if we can. So this is the idea of the future, and what does that entail? Let me show you in the next slide. It needs that electricity generation, which is fairly fuel source agnostic, be done with something like clean coal, nuclear, renewable sources, natural gas, to the extent that possible. Of course, oil will continue to be used for transportation. It will take 50 years before you can displace oil, but it's going to have to be done slowly. And on the demand side, we go to more efficient use using storage technologies, both for managing the load and to enable use of renewable sources. So that's sort of like the dream of a sustainable future. Next slide, please. What does that mean in terms of electricity generation? The projected goal then, I'm just showing you this, is to displace the use of oil to the extent possible by increasing electricity gradually, and this is going to go on if that happens, generation from various sources, renewables, from natural gas, nuclear, whatever it is, and use that in some way to displace oil. So that is sort of the strategic idea behind this. Whether it will happen is difficult to say because you start down a certain path and then something happens and you require a different direction. But that's the plan. Okay, next slide, please. Now, there are certain constraints, and I wanted to show you this. It's not that you can hit any sort of cost which is realistic unless you take certain things into account. Just look at it globally. If we took the whole income of the world, which is up there, and its whole energy usage, and divided it, it would come to 44 cents a kilowatt hour. Okay. So that's the maximum you can pay for energy, okay, roughly. Now, if we take a more realistic target, usually 10% of GDP on energy use is considered to be ideal. Whether it is or not, in India it's a little bit more, but it's considered to be ideal. In the US, 2 cents a kilowatt hour for energy. Okay. And in Germany about 7, and India and China about 2. Okay, so those are what would be considered ideal situations, 10% of GDP. So this represents what we call a desirable bound on the cost of energy, given the current situation. Of course, it's interactive. As GDP increases, energy use does not necessarily increase in proportion, So you move to the capability to spend more on energy, and maybe you come to 7 cents a kilowatt hour like Germany. But that's really a pretty clear target. When you look at these, it tells you what renewable energy ultimately has to try to hit. Currently, most of the energy used in the US and Germany fall within this range except for renewables. And I'm going to have a slide later on which will give you the costs, and you will see that wind, solar are well above these numbers, way above. So in order to make them cost competitive, there has to be a huge amount of investment and innovation put into trying to get their costs down. Now, admittedly, the cost of solar is coming down very strongly. Cost of wind is coming down very strongly. But we've got a long way to go before that can happen. Okay, next slide, please. Don't worry about this very busy part. This is put up by somebody in my office to do this. But at the moment, again, the units have changed. But coal is coming in at about 10 cents a kilowatt hour. Roughly what numbers I showed you before. So it's a little bit above 10%. Natural gas comes in right about the number that we're talking about 7 cents a kilowatt hour. Nuclear comes in with the new construction at about 10 cents a kilowatt hour. The old nuclear costs almost nothing. It's of the order of 1 or 2 cents a kilowatt hour, because those plants have been paid off and they're running at 80-year life. So a nuclear plant is like a dam. It goes on producing forever. Wind is competitive. It's coming in around 10 cents a kilowatt hour right now. Solar is about 21 cents. Offshore wind about 24 cents. Solar thermal about 31 cents. I've been very generous here. With wind, to get that number, I've given it a 34% capacity factor, which means that you've got an enormous amount of storage. Typically, in California, for example, you're allowed only to count 13% on the capacity factor. Maybe in India you can count 14, I don't know what the number is. But this is more than double. Okay, so actual price of wind is roughly twice that number. Okay, 2.5 times. And I've also been very generous with the solar. So even with this great generosity, you can see that renewables have a long way to go. And the key to getting these high capacity factors is going to be storage. To drive wind up to 34%, you've got to have enormous amounts of storage as a capacity factor. Next slide. This is just to show you another problem. This is where the existing transmission networks in the US are. You don't need to know the details, but you can see the densities are sort of in this region and that region, and it's all very sparse in the middle. And the reason for this is historic. That's where the population centers have been, that's where the power plants have been. But they don't coincide where the renewable resources are. So next slide, please. This is where the wind, this is where the solar is. Most of the solar is in this region, in the US. And they're very far from this area where you saw the dense transmission network. So you've got a huge problem in getting the solar stuff, even if you could produce it, to where it's needed. And it's more difficult to build a transmission network in the US than to build a nuclear plant. Okay, so that just keeps it in perspective. There are 13 nuclear plants under construction and almost no new transmission lines. So it's extremely difficult to get it built. Okay, so that's one other problem. Let me show you where the wind is. Next slide, please. All the wind is in this region, at least the offshore. There is some wind in Texas, this Midwest region, but it's there. And again, it doesn't coincide. This coincides a little better than solar with where the use is. So congestion and on the transmission lines becomes a very big issue. And one of the ways that you can, again, relieve congestion is by storage. So that gives you, without going into the details, one of the other reasons why you want to have storage, so you can transmit when there is no demand to use the existing transmission lines. Otherwise, the transmission lines will only be meeting the peak demands. Next slide. I wanted to talk briefly about coal, because coal is, whether we like it or not, going to be an extremely important resource. And if there is a carbon dioxide problem, then the only way one would be able to use it was with some form of carbon sequestration. What I wanted to illustrate to you here is that if you have carbon sequestration, it means carbon dioxide removal, so it'll drive up the cost of coal a little bit. Not all that much. It's about $60 a ton of CO2 using the amine process. The real problem is how do you store it? And the carbon dioxide sequestration has been shown to be feasible, whether it's completely safe, one doesn't know, in various types of formations like aquifers, in old oil and gas fields, in certain coal beds. And what I wanted to illustrate with this is that in the US, coincidentally, the coal plants were built in areas where the possibility of sequestration is pretty good. It's remarkable, actually, if you look at it, that the sequestration possibilities are in the region where the coal plants are. That doesn't coincide with what happened in China. If you look at China, they have almost no possibilities to store in geological formations where the coal plants currently are. So they would have to transport it quite a distance. I haven't got a map of China, but there's a similar one of China. Okay, so this is, in a sustainable future, I think coal will probably have to play a role. And probably if carbon dioxide is a problem, sequestration has to go ahead with it, be a sort of part of the strategy. Anyway, now let me move on. I wanted to talk to you about batteries. Okay. So one possibility is to store energy directly, electricity. Electricity being source agnostic is a particularly useful thing to make. Doesn't matter how you make it. Transmission can be done with the existing networks. Storage is the big issue. The way things are stored is basically through chemistry. Okay, what you have is a cathode and an anode, which is some chemical material. And there's a reaction that occurs. Okay? In one case, the reaction generates or uses up electrons. In the other case, the reaction produces electrons. This was actually an animation, which is not working right now. Otherwise, you'd see them going around. Okay, and electrons only transfer along these so-called electrodes. And the electrolyte only transmits ions, okay, between the two electrodes. The ions take part in the reaction, produce the electrons, which then run something, and the ions flow this way, or when they reach out, they flow that way, and the electrons flow this way. So this thing called the electrolyte doesn't transmit electrons, but only ions. Ions are charged atoms. Electrons are little things that move around the atoms. Okay, so that's how a battery works. Next slide, please. Here is, I don't know if you can see it because it's not very clear, an idea of where we have batteries in terms of their energy and power. Maybe it's not very clear, but it shows you that you have electrochemical storage in things called capacitors, which have high power but very low energy storage. But what do I mean by power? It can give up its energy really fast, and by energy density, it can store a lot of energy. So batteries and fuel cells are typically things which can store a lot of energy, but they give it up relatively slowly. So they can't be used for frequency control, because in the electric grid, you need to keep the frequency roughly the same. So they are a good way to store energy, but not a good way to actually regulate the frequency. For that, you need capacitors or electrochemical capacitors. That's all this was showing. Next slide. The idea then is that what you have is storage at various levels. You can have storage in the power stations or the substations. You can have it in transmission and distribution networks. You can have it near your wind farms. And then you can probably have the storage within the place where you're using it. This is an area where we've been very interested, because in places like New York, the real problem arises in the distribution networks rather than the sources of energy. There is a lot of energy from natural gas or from nuclear in New York or whatever, but distributing it within Manhattan or within the boroughs is a big problem. So if you can put storage either in the distribution points or in the large buildings, that's the most economic solution. Okay, so this gives you an idea of the storage. Next slide, please. All right, this slide is what you wanted to see, some of you. Where are we in terms of is sequestered for waste disposal and decommissioning? And there is today an $88 billion fund which the utilities are suing the government for, because the government was supposed to have provided waste disposal facilities. But due to the political issues with Yucca Mountain, mainly Harry Reid's problem. Harry Reid is the senator from Nevada, and he happens to be the Democratic Senate House leader. And of course, you understand politics. So he made a deal with Obama that if Obama got elected, that he would withdraw support for Yucca Mountain. Now, that's what they did. And the utilities are suing the government for $88 billion because the government owes them that much. Now, it'll be settled, but the problem will be that they'll have to do on-site storage.
Mm-hmm. On-site, where the nuclear plants are?
Yeah, because, you see, you can store 100 years of nuclear fuel in what they call these dry casks within the size of about a football field, okay, a little bit less. So it's perfectly feasible to store the nuclear waste in these dry casks there, and that's what will be done right now, because the government, now this is all in the law courts right now. Now if the next administration, the Democrats lose the Senate, Yucca Mountain will be back. And at the moment they're also suing the Secretary of Energy because Steve Chu, well, he was an unwilling tool of Harry Reid. We don't want to get into this right now. Yeah.
The problem with storing waste is it's not a passive process as I understand it. You have waste heat that you need to take away.
That's the passive, the storage does that.
Okay.
It's free convection with air.
Right. But how durable are those systems? I mean, free convection is obviously far superior to force, but is it still pretty durable? I mean, we are in the post-Fukushima world. But I guess that's your topic for tomorrow. So.
Yes. No, but no, the waste is not the issue. I think the storage is, there's almost no dispute that I know of on dry storage. On site, I mean, there is the odd thing that comes about, but they've even fired missiles at these to make sure that they, terrorist attack will stand up to it, stuff like that. So they're basically 4 feet of concrete within which there is 3 linings, and they're cooled by free convection of air, so they're completely passive. And as far as I know, that's not the area under dispute. The dispute is the central storage. And it's not to do actually with the feasibility of the storage, but simply the political thing that it's in Nevada. And, when Congress passed the law, Nevada was not that powerful. And they said, well, we got done out of, if they got a bigger payment, they'd probably agree. I'm not sure. Harry Reid maybe is holding out for more money. I don't get into politics. I don't know about this. But it's a political scene, basically. Let me go back to the cost. This side is the cost, capital cost in terms of power. And this side is the capital cost in terms of stored energy. Okay. You can see that the most economical system is where you can get it, pumped hydro. But unfortunately, pumped hydro, which is to store it behind dams or something, is where you want to be, but that's not feasible everywhere, unless you're Norway or Bhutan or something. The second is to store air in caverns. Okay? And there are only there are a couple of installations where this is done. Other than that, you're almost all in the so-called battery space. If you need very high powers, maybe you can be in flywheel space. But this whole area is batteries. And of the batteries currently, lead-acid batteries are very attractive. The only thing which is not attractive about lead-acid batteries is their lifetimes. They're relatively short, so that for a utility who wants a 15 to 30-year life, it's very hard to guarantee more than 3 to 5 year life for that. Okay. And there are no technologies today where these are being used at utility scales. There is a set of nickel-cadmium batteries which are being used in Alaska, a big, I think 45 megawatt system, and those are attractive other than the problems with the disposal of the cadmium. They're pretty high cost. So the area that we are interested in is specifically in this area. I've put metal air, but it doesn't have to be metal air. There are metal anode batteries, which can come down to the cost of pumped hydro. And this is the innovation which is going on more in this area right now. It's mainly to produce energy when needed, and it's not, as I said, for frequency control, it's not very high power. It's less high power, but it's high energy density and relatively low cost. Everybody wants to be around $100 a kilowatt hour, if possible. So think of a Duracell. Okay, a Duracell is a metal anode battery. It's a zinc anode battery. Duracell is not rechargeable. Okay, it's the one you put in your flashlight. These alkaline batteries, they're $33 a kilowatt hour. They're extremely economical. So if you could make a rechargeable Duracell, how would you do that is quite a trick. But if you could make a rechargeable Duracell, even at $100 a kilowatt hour, you would own the market because you'd be pumped hydro at that point. Okay, so that's the whole interest. And that's why there is so much emphasis on energy storage right now, because it would enable renewables by making it much more economical. It would relieve congestion, make your transmission distribution systems work much better, relieve congestion in cities, and of course, as you have power cuts, it could be used to back up the current grid, and off-grid or even side-grid. Next slide, please. So this is some batteries we've been doing. This is like a rechargeable Duracell. We turned it from a solid to a battery where you can manage the electrolyte and do the chemistry. The targets are to get down to about $100 a kilowatt hour, which we are not at yet, but that's what we'd like to do. With 5,000 deep cycles, okay? And we're on the way. We've built large systems, and we are roughly here. A 50 kilowatt hour system would power a building like this, roughly. Okay. And if you want to go to a substation, you need to scale it to about a megawatt hour, which could be made out of several of these 50 kilowatt hour units. Okay, so that's the sort of interest in this technology. Next slide, please. So, okay, let's go to the last slide so that I don't keep on keeping people busy. One more slide. Yeah. So my conclusion is, for a sustainable future, the most important thing to reduce or slow down use of would be oil. It doesn't mean that there isn't a huge amount of oil in the world. I was just in Rio and talking with Petrobras, where they found, as you know, the pre-salt oil. The pre-salt oil, when Gondwana land started to separate, there was this huge lake with salt there, a large saltwater lake, and all the organic material that went under was preserved. So now you have the Atlantic Ocean, and under 4,000, no, it's at 7,500 meters, the pre-salt oil. You have 3,000 meters of sea and 4,000 meters of salt. And they're trying to get it out, and it's a huge resource. And they think that there's a similar resource of Angola. So we're talking about probably a lot of oil there in the world, and it'll be used slowly. But we want to reduce as much as possible the use of oil. Substitution of electricity for oil, I think, is feasible. The recent lithium-ion battery fires in cars, however, have not been, the way to go, I think. But probably there'll be something beyond lithium, and it must slowly come in over the next 30 to 50 years. Renewables as a source of electricity generation are extremely attractive, and I think is absolutely the way to go, but the cost must come down. And the usage of renewables with electricity storage, I think, will be a way to go in the future. For this to happen, not only should the cost of renewables come down, but the cost of the storage systems will have to come down. And I think there are promising new technologies in both areas which would allow us to develop in these directions. So I think with that, I'll stop.
Thank you. We're going to open up for, maybe we can have the lights on now. We're going to open up for discussion, and I'll take the prerogative of the chair to throw out the first question. Essentially what Professor Banerjee has been arguing is that I think you didn't use the word, but what has been coming across is trade-offs. Trade-offs between energy density and power output, trade-offs between the lifetime of your energy storage for different applications versus safety considerations, and of course trade-offs between different energy sources. I know at your energy institute you have a mantra of being energy agnostic, and I think that certainly when you are looking at the economy as a whole, there are no two ways around it. But I wanted to reflect on the last kind of set of comments that you made. If we are increasingly finding new sources of oil, however kind of physically difficult to extract them, they are kind of approaching commercial scale. What is the kind of economic or commercial logic or driver that will continue pushing research into energy storage technologies, which would make renewables more viable? The number I had, and you could correct me, is that unlike computers, where we have this Moore's law and we have the doubling of computing power every 18 months, on the energy storage side, apparently in the last 150 years, since the mid-1800s, we've increased that density and capacity by only 6-fold. So clearly we don't progress as fast on energy storage as we would like to, especially in the current climate of climate change. So with fossil fuels still being certainly commercially viable and we have finding new sources, what is the commercial driver to help the switch?
I think this is a very good question, and in fact, there may be none, which is an unfortunate answer. But let me sort of give you a couple of points of view. One is that even if oil is available from these vast new sources, it'll be at a higher price. So $100 a barrel seems almost a low price for some of these. So whatever technologies, whether they be renewable or renewables plus storage, must come in to be competitive with that. I think that's the first thing. You can't have a subsidy situation forever. Otherwise, you get into this unstable situation like one did with the banks and stuff. So we have to assume that subsidies can only exist for a brief period of time, and but eventually they have to be competitive in cost terms. So I think $100 a barrel of oil it is a fairly reasonable number. The oil companies now are being valued at about between $60 and $80 a barrel based on their existing resources. So $100 is a reasonable target. At that point, you also have the tar sands. So whatever you're doing, you've got to hit that target in terms of cost. And I think you can do that if you've got solar, wind, storage coming to targets like for storage $100 a kilowatt hour. If you can do it with that and 10 to 15 year lifetime, that's very economical. It will compete with oil or even natural gas at that point. If you can bring solar down using various manufacturing technologies or whatever down to producing at about 10 cents a kilowatt hour, you begin to get economic. So I think that's part of it. However, there is a second part to it, that the oil is not distributed uniformly. So there is a huge premium that countries are willing to pay for security of supply. And that's probably where you've got a case that people are willing to pay more if needed just to have a certain security of supply. So that, as I said, there are two parts. One is economic, the other is national security to that. But economics will, I think, win at the end. You've got to bring it down. Yeah. You've got to bring the cost down. Yeah.
Question, I mean, it's a bit off the book, but...
Could you introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Dr. Sumendra Bhattacharya from Thornton Reed's Bombay. Sure. There are like 3 different research areas today under focus. You have the transmission technologies where people are innovating at new materials. Like recently, a professor at Rice made a 1 meter long carbon nanotube wire. So you could cut down your I-square losses. Then you have the storage technologies. Now, unfortunately, in the last 5 years, I think US has phased out the importance to hydrogen which they were giving it before. Wow. And then you have the fuel source technologies where you actually look at new materials which can give you power at, efficiently. So where do you actually see the research moving through? I mean, in which direction do you see the commercial interest as well as government's interest? Because NSF funding, if I look at since 1996, 96 to 2001, there was a big boom to look into hydrogen storage technologies, where they explored carbon nanotubes. They have also explored hydrides, metal hydrides. They made nanowires out of it. And then suddenly the government phased it out and they went into fuel cells. Then they went into solar.
Well, fuel cells was with hydrogen.
With hydrogen.
Using hydrogen.
But then hydrogen, the investment has actually sort of come up. So does that mean that they have lost faith on the concept of hydrogen being a replacement or an alternate energy source?
So let me give you the argument, what happened. Hydrogen was only used in the form of something which could store and transmit energy. It had to be formed in some way. So the formation usually was by electrolysis. So it was to generate, say, electricity by wind or solar or whatever, generate hydrogen, transmit the hydrogen, and then recombine it in a fuel cell. So maybe a fuel cell in a car or a stationary fuel cell, it doesn't matter how you do it. The overall round-trip efficiency of this was about 87% for the electrolysis to 90% at the best. Okay, transmission and storage came to, you lost, it was, let's say, most optimistically 80%, and the best fuel cells were at around 50%. So your overall round-trip efficiency, electricity to electricity, is 35% roughly, compared to a lithium-ion battery, which is over 90%, 95%. So if you could, you'd have to do it at 1/3 the price of a lithium-ion battery to be able to make that cycle economical. Just because of the efficiency, you're getting back 1/3 compared to it. Now, you can say, okay, there's transmission losses, which is roughly 7% of electricity. There is, of course, it's directly electricity to electricity. There is, of course, there are costs of the lithium-ion battery which are higher than, say, your fuel cells. So if you take all that into account, hydrogen, because it also needed a completely new transmission distribution network, came under a lot of pressure. And it was political. It's just like the waste problem, in the sense that it was seen as in the interests of the big oil companies, because it was a way to stall moving away from the use of oil. It's perceived as simply a ploy to delay a substitute for oil being found, which the market was finding anyway with hybrid cars and things. So you see, that was part of the reason why the move went to electricity. It doesn't mean that your carbon nanotube wires or superconducting transmission lines, which are already being built in small quantities, will not go forward. I think they will. But probably in the near term, the main use of hydrogen will be by the defense people, because they don't care about cost. Okay, so
You had a question?
yeah.
Sorry, the lady behind you, and then we'll come back. Could you introduce?
Sure. My name is Nidhi Dixit, and I work for Center for Science, Technology and Policy, Bangalore. I'm more into materials aspects of the battery, since we are working on developing next generation lithium-ion batteries, especially for our troops at high altitude, like Siachen, Dras, Kargil sector and winters. That's where the lithium-ion batteries are failing beyond minus 30 degrees.
Right.
Now, what we do is we basically use quantum mechanics simulations, and along with the data mining, pattern recognition techniques like artificial neural network, like you mentioned in your talk, what we do is we predict new materials within the lithium-ion battery context and see if, number one, we can move away from lithium, maybe reduce it incrementally because we don't have lithium in India and we are dependent on export of the, import of the batteries. Similarly, can we use some kind of materials, methodology, technique to address the material challenges in sodium sulfur or related batteries which are crucial for wind energy integration with the grid? Is there any outstanding material issues that we can also study along with the lithium program?
Well, I think that you've put your hands on several very key issues. First of all, I think lithium is not widely distributed. So there is an issue with security of supply, as always, lithium. Second, lithium-ion batteries don't perform very well at low temperatures. Though there's been some areas where instead of using an amorphous carbon anode, they're using lithium titanates, which go to lower temperatures, and they're lithium iron phosphates. But these are existing technologies, you know. So, in other words, they're commercialized right now. But the low temperature capability is a problem. That there may be ways around this by keeping the batteries warm in some way. So I don't know that you will ever find a lithium-ion battery that will go down to minus 30 or minus 40, but you're looking for it.
Well, it seems it does work, minus 30, because the temperature goes as low as minus 48 Celsius.
Yeah.
At the higher altitudes of Siachen peaks, as you know, it's a group of peaks that constitute Siachen coasts.
Yeah.
But beyond minus 30, definitely there's a big problem the troops are facing.
Yeah.
But sodium sulfur, I don't think the temperature being big, you know. Big,
Sodium sulfur is molten anyway.
Yeah, it's molten anyway. So in terms of material challenges, like I know insulator is a big problem and you have corrosion issues. Is there anything we can do to go to the next level of sodium sulfur? You know, instead of starting from scratch.
Sodium sulfur, there are problems in that they are very, if the liner, which is a beta alumina liner between sodium and sulfur, cracks or breaks in any way, you get a very bad fire. And in fact, the NGK batteries which were being used have all been shut down because they had a big sodium sulfur fire in Japan. So these were built into the megawatt scales for wind
Around
integration.
32, 35, yes.
Yeah, and it was, they're expensive. They're about $2,000 a kilowatt hour in storage. But the safety issues are quite significant with those batteries. So there are sodium nickel chloride batteries that General Electric are now building, also with a beta alumina separator, which seem to be somewhat safer, but they still have the problem that it's still molten sodium that you have to deal with.
Yes.
Okay, so that's another direction. Our interest is primarily in zinc anode batteries, where you electroplate zinc on and off. Okay, those have better capabilities in terms of safety because, you know, it's zinc, potassium hydroxide, and manganese dioxide or something. So that all of them are pretty, other than potassium hydroxide, are pretty innocuous materials. However, their low temperature capability depends on when the high molar sodium or potassium hydroxide freezes. So there's always issues with temperature and environmental effects. So you'll face zinc, which is what we've been doing mainly. So maybe that gives you a second.
Thank you.
Mr. Khanna, you had a question, and then I'll come there, and then I'll come back to you. Okay. Why don't we do one thing? Why don't we collect, groups of 3 questions? So, at least start. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you. I'm R.K. Khanna, former Chief Engineer, Environment from Central Water Commission, environmental issues of water and hydropower. My question is slightly different. In the concluding slides you mentioned that cost of renewables should come down. Correct, is okay. But if you also consider the environmental impacts and environmental costs, because hydropower is quite eco-friendly, then maybe it may score higher than others.
Hydro.
Yeah, hydro and pump hydro, especially that you mentioned.
Well, in the situation here, it might be eco-friendly, but in the US at least, it's not considered to be particularly eco-friendly because of the, if you have to displace habitats or impact, regions where there are villages, depending on the scale of the operation. And even in Bhutan, there are issues. I was just in Washington State where they have this Grand Coulee Dam, and there was this huge outcry going on because there was a particular species of fish whose habitats had been affected and they hadn't built the proper fish ladders for it. So there are big environmental impacts of hydro which are not obvious. In fact, in Bhutan, one of my friends was the Minister of the Environment, and he was saying that they have not been able to transport the Mosier up against the dams. So it's not obvious. In some cases it's great. Norway, it seems to work well because they are in such remote areas anyway. Nobody knows what's there. But other than that,
That's right, impacts are there and we have to manage, but compared to thermal and other environmental
maybe
effects,
less.
much severe. Yeah.
But maybe not so. Well, even with wind, there is an impact. I mean, people are saying they're banned in Norway. You can't build a windmill in Norway because they are so unsightly that you cross the border into Sweden, you see the windmills on the other side. There are none. So
if you consider the cost of displacement of the people when you construct a hydropower plant, the cost is tremendous. Social cost connected with the big large scale hydro is very high. We cannot really compare it with the wind and solar in that way.
But we can compare with thermal and other systems.
See, all of them are cost. Thermal. When we talk about thermal power plant nowadays,
existing solar thermal plants today are using some molten salts for thermal storage, mainly sodium nitrates. And they're a little expensive, but if you can bring the cost down, it would be nice. Because, of course, it increases your capacity factor and usage. So that's one area where thermal storage is extremely important. People are trying to drive towards also thermal storage systems which are based on cheaper materials like high capacity rubble or rock. So this is quite an active area. It's fairly particular to trying to store at the plant itself rather than down the pipeline. There is also some work which is looking at thermochemical reactions for thermal storage. For example, just say calcium hydroxide, decomposing it into water and calcium oxide and then recombining it, and that generates a fair amount of energy. So it's an active area, but it's not, let's say, as widely deployable. It's more in relation to solar thermal plants, which is its first interesting use, at least from the point of view of the utilities. There is some thought being given to, and some work being done, but not that much, on distributed solar thermal storage in buildings, mainly for absorption chillers for air conditioning, hot water, and also for heating. The current systems which are being used that I've seen, there are some in New York, solar thermal panels on the roof they're mainly hot water systems, large hot water tanks. There's no phase change materials. We are actually working on some phase change materials, I didn't tell you, which are slurries for solar thermal storage and also for ice slurries. So it is, but it's getting less attention at the moment. Certainly storing cold is important too, as well as storing heat.
If there was a cheap, viable thermal storage technology, then couldn't conventional power plants use it instead of increasing the capacity of the power plant?
You mean use it to shape the peak? Yes, they could. They could say you could run a, at the moment, if you look at capacity factors for coal plants in the US, on the average they're about 60% because they use full load following. So you could potentially run a natural gas plant or a coal plant at a higher capacity factor and store it. But you'd have to have high temperature storage. And that's not come along quite as well.
I don't think high temperature storage will be a problem. I mean, in CSP, the problem is reaching those temperatures. I mean, the temperatures that are currently being reached are around 400 degrees Celsius. But in conventional plants, you could easily go up to 800, 900. And
so at 800, 900 with good efficiency, there's no, yeah, that would be very smooth.
Yes. So, connected to Lodhi, but on a more larger scale, where India has decided to build 20 gigawatts of solar by 2022, and that's one of the targets they have. Now, if we take an example of Tamil Nadu, where there is already hundreds of megawatts of wind, and which has destabilized their grid because of infirm power. Today, 80% of solar is going to Rajasthan, and even if we assume 50%, you will see 10 gigawatts of solar in Rajasthan 10 years down the line. So, there's a huge destabilization we are expecting in Rajasthan. I feel that storage is a little bit laggy, as you rightly mentioned, and to connect, as the title suggests, of renewables into storage, you need a battery and CSP storage coming into power. I don't see that happening. So where do you see bottleneck in terms of future?
Well, in the US, the bottleneck has been simply that you have been able to sell storage and wind into the grid with first priority, right? So it's been structured in such a way that there hasn't been any incentive to put into the storage market. Because if you're an independent power producer, you have the right to sell. And so whether the grid destabilizes or not is the problem of the grid, not yours as an IPP. So people have had to bring down the coal plants or whatever to increase the stability of the grid. When your wind is blowing, and you have power, you've got to do it. And as you know, there's a severe problem with grid stability as soon as you penetrate more than maybe 10-15% of the market. There's no other way to solve this, as I understand it, without either using your power plants as batteries, which then you bring the whole power plants down, or putting batteries. And part of the reason it has lagged is that the legislation has not been there. Now, in the last 6 months in California, there's been a rule passed that batteries can be considered as IPPs, which means that you could buy from the wind resource and sell to the grid. And you could make enough money, and they are giving a subsidy of some amount to get that started, to encourage exactly the problem, trying to make storage a viable economic proposition. Unless there are economic incentives, nobody's going to do it, right? That's the way it is. So at the moment, there's been no economic incentives. You build your solar plant or you build your wind and you have the right to sell, so what do you care? You just sell. And then somebody, Southern Cal Edison, has to bring down its plant for you.
You had a question, sir? Yes. Please introduce yourself.
I'm Rahul from Schneider Electric. Two small questions. First of all, we discussed about the solar thermal storage which you mentioned. What's the price? Like, is it comparable to $100 per kilowatt hour?
It's less.
It's less.
Yeah, because it's thermal, no? The other is kilowatt hour electric.
Right, so what I'm trying to say is that the same technology cannot be used for, say, electricity storage?
Well, most of the thermal storage systems today, in solar plants and so on, are phase change materials, though there are other technologies which are being considered, thermochemical reactions or just sensible heat storage. At the moment, those are ways to store heat, right? So in order to make electricity, you have to run some sort of a turbine or something with it, which is fine because in a solar plant you've got your turbine anyway, so you just storing it during the day, using it at night or whatever. The same technologies are not. Using it at the plant is fine because you're going to lose that efficiency of the cycle anyway. So it'll be your cycle is 40% efficient or whatever. Now, to take electricity, convert it back to heat, and then convert it back to electricity,
the efficiency
is very low.
Okay.
So, so if you're going to use it to your end use is heat storage, that's fine. That's why I was saying ice slurries, for example. There's one of my colleagues works on this, where to supplement air conditioning loads, for example, so you store the ice at night and you use it during the day. And that's, in fact, we are working with Con Edison exactly on this problem, because at the moment, the way they make ice, people do this already, is fairly massively. So it takes you a long time to store the energy, but it also takes you a long time to get it out. So it doesn't meet your peak. How to get the high power when you need it out? There's a lot of new technology to be developed there in the thermal storage. To get high power and high energy density.
Right.
Okay.
And something on the compressed air.
Right.
The cost and the efficiency.
That's a very good question. If you have a natural area like a cavern or whatever, that you can store the compressed air, it's very efficient. I think I showed you on the curve, it was like a dam. It's in that same category. With compressed air on a decreased scale, it's less easy because there are certain risks associated with it, explosions and things like that. Now people have put sets of pipes underground to reduce this and tried it, but once you start to do that, the cost starts to go up. Because of the you have to make fairly long pipes, which are high tensile strength, and cover it with something so if it bursts or something, if there's a flaw, there isn't a big issue. Now, Tata bought a company from the Swiss to actually, they had developed some technology where if the tank breaks, fragments, it doesn't kill anybody. you know. Now, whether, I don't know what they have done with that technology. Also, when you compress air, it generates heat. And you have to reuse that heat when you decompress that air. So there has to be some storage system.
Okay.
Otherwise, your thermodynamic efficiency goes down. So there are few little problems with it. But it's not out of the question. Definitely, we have to use everything we can.
But actually, they have used ceramic bricks
Yeah,
for
storing the heat.
heat, and then when it's
Yeah.
when it is on the second side, when it is fed into the grid, you use that same heat.
Yeah.
That's why the efficiency goes on as high as 90%.
Yeah, it can go, but you have to
Yeah,
you have to store the energy.
Yes.
Yeah.
But then you're compressing it and keeping it at 65 to 70 atmosphere. That's where the high tensile strength material need is highlighted.
Mr. Palabatra, you had a question?
No.
Okay. So, your Saran and then.
A couple of quick questions. From your presentation, it seems that particularly because you said the waste costs are not a problem and the safety is not probably that
No,
big a concern.
with what?
Nuclear waste, I'm sorry.
Okay.
So from your cost picture...
Safety could be more of a concern.
Okay,
I said waste is not a concern.
okay.
At least should not be a concern. It's a political concern. It's not a technical concern.
But you're not advocating that nuclear is the best way to go overall. Since your costs are comparable and a lot of the problems plaguing these other technologies don't seem to...
See, I have a much more, as I said, he said I was an agnostic view. I think that you should mix and match and not have too much dependence on any one. Yeah, any one technology. So what it does, it gives your system more resilience. And that's the reason. And I think nuclear will be deployed in the US, certainly. Whatsoever. Yeah, so, but that doesn't mean that, well, China is faced with this extreme problem with coal pollution. I mean, you go to Chongqing, I mean, you cannot breathe, you cannot see, you know, there's 30 million people living in that situation. So they have very little options. They'll probably try to clean up their coal plants. They'll probably build nuclear. They're building as much solar as they can, as quickly as possible. I mean, they're doing everything they can, right? So I would advocate a balanced portfolio. You know, I once started a company that I had a director of it was a guy named Bill Sharp. He invented something called Sharp ratios. He won the Nobel Prize for it. And the main thing about Sharp ratios is how to minimize the overall risk from your portfolio while maximizing the profit. And he had a sort of a measure which was the volatility of something versus the cost. So the problem, as you see, oil is extremely volatile in cost. So if you have something which is so dependent on oil, your whole economy is very dangerous. That's all I'm saying, really. You want to diversify.
My other quick question was, just one more, was regarding pump storage. Is it viable to have pump storage on coastal areas where you have saline water and in some form artificially raise it to heights and then utilize it again? Because if that were possible, then wind, particularly sites are located much more on the coast. And that
Yeah,
would be a thing.
it's only a question of how much you have to raise it. You know, clearly the cost of the structures start to matter. But wind, offshore wind is very attractive, and the storage is an issue. So if you could use low head hydro of some sort, it's been looked at, but I think the costs are pretty high from what I'm not an expert at this area. So,
I'm V.S. Sharma from CEEW. You have given a figure so that ultimately what would be viable is $100 per kilowatt hour with a battery life of 10 to 15 years. Now, as per the research going on in your university or elsewhere in the world, what time frame do you see this being achieved approximately?
To become commercial?
Yeah, to
I
match
would
these
say-
parameters
Yeah, so at $100 a kilowatt hour,
with 10 to 15 years.
10 to 15 years life, your costs are coming similar to pump storage. That was the
Yes,
reason
that was-
I gave you that number. I think to be realistic, for this to be commercial, I think there are ventures already starting to spin off in this area. But to be commercial will be 5 to 10 years. I mean, truly commercial, to have proven performance in the marketplace. That means that you have several thousand large units deployed, which are all working. You know, for example, sodium sulfur batteries, I'll give you an example, had $2,000 a kilowatt hour, and they had 15 to 30 year life. Right? And they were being deployed even at that cost, because you know, the numbers I gave you were very ambitious. But if you could achieve them, they were clearly economic. But for sodium sulfur batteries, even at the higher costs, they were sufficiently interesting that the utilities would deploy them. And they had maybe 20, 30, maybe more, 50 installations. Megawatt scale, large. And then one caught fire. And this is exactly the problem which I was saying about resilience. And they all had to be shut down. The fire took like a few days to put out. And they actually built a sand hill around it to put it out. So, you know, these are the sort of issues that hit you. If the $100 a kilowatt hour can be done, safety becomes a paramount issue at the end.
No, even with full safety, what's the, because why I'm asking this is because this is one of the main factors which is going to shape the future of solar in India, as per my understanding, because that means which way it goes, whether it goes the solar thermal way, which clearly has a satisfactory storage mechanism, or it goes the photovoltaic way, because the initial development, 5,000, 10,000, it doesn't matter, but when it goes beyond, say, as somebody was saying, regarding the grid stability, which cannot be achieved without having a satisfactory storage in photovoltaic. So, companies investing in solar thermal will be very cautious about this, that after all, if, when is this going to be achieved? So you don't see less than 7-8 years for this to be fully commercial.
Yeah, I think that's a realistic number.
Unless it's disruptive innovation.
But even with disruptive, I mean, you know, the energy business, the time scales of things are larger. So if you had to put in solar thermal, that you might have several strategies that you may deploy. You know, you can afford a battery more than $100 a kilowatt hour. You may buy something which is $400 a kilowatt hour, and you may still find that is okay. So the initial installations you could do at a higher price. It's only a matter of money. If you're willing to pay more money, you can get 10,000 cycles out of a battery today.
Yeah, but then I cannot compete with the other power.
You'll need a subsidy. Otherwise it would be hard, yeah. That's just...
I didn't see any other hands. Am I missing anyone? Oh, there was a question.
If you look at your own the CO2 emission, which has to be the basic concern in the environmental aspect of it, the transportation do require a sort of an innovation in the sustainable energy futures. What do you see the direction in that area? Because if you look at today the transportation, the so-called hybrid car, also is not really taking off for the reason of any energy efficiency part of it. So there has to be some sort of a thrust need to be compulsorily given in transportation area when you're talking about a sustainable energy futures, and which apparently is missing the attention of the most of the energy analysts and trying to focus more on the stationary energy sources. So what do you really see the direction that should be in the case of transportation area in this?
So transportation was the area that received the first attention, and you know, if you look at all these lithium-ion factories that have been built now, they're primarily for transportation purposes. They would be for plug-in hybrid vehicles, or maybe even fully electric vehicles with a backup gas engine or something. And the problem with that has been that the focus has been primarily on lithium batteries. Okay, so I think today, if you want reliable lithium batteries which lasts a long time, the cost is somewhat high, but you can buy them, and that's why I was saying, if you wanted to store solar electric today, this is a stationary use, you could capitalize on the transportation sector expertise and buy fairly economic lithium-ion batteries. They may not last as long as you would like. They may not have the deep cycle capability, and they may be more costly, but they're there. The problem in transportation is weight. So I think there is a lot of interest right now in what you would call beyond lithium. What can you do beyond lithium? But things go in waves. So I only know the American financing situation. The initial wave was transportation, and a lot of factories have been financed. Whether they're going to be profitable, we don't know. I think a lot of them will go bankrupt. In fact, they have been overfinanced because there will be too many factories built. So maybe an opportunity to buy some of these relatively inexpensively for the solar business. And then now the interest is in the stationary battery use, because the whole emphasis has now shifted to the grid. These are fashions that come and fashions that go. So I think the next return will be when a sufficient number of lithium-ion batteries have caught fire, it will come back to being again transportation. You know, it just goes. I'm a skeptic, so that's it. But it will come back, I'm sure. Yeah.
We'll take a last final question from Vidla.
Yeah, I just had a comment actually for the hybrid electric transportation that you said. We in Karnataka, we are involved with the public transportation, where you have the lithium-ion battery and diesel combination, because we don't have CNG in Karnataka, as you all know. So what we did, the Karnataka government set up a task force last year, which CEEW is heading now, on the to develop a roadmap going from all diesel transportation to have some percentage of that as the either plug-in hybrid buses for public transportation, or even cars. I mean, but the emphasis is more on public transportation.
What is the percentage like lithium-ion and diesel approximately?
Yeah, okay, it depends on the severity of hybridization. You can go for a conventional hybrid, like you have the Toyota Prius, where majority of the work done is by the IC engine, whether it's a petrol or diesel. And then for the Delta, you get to the electric motor, which is driven by nickel metal hydride batteries. But then if you talk about plug-in hybrid, like Chevrolet Volt, I come from General Motor background, so I was involved with that program. So the public domain knowledge is that we have the plug-in hybrid electric vehicle configuration, where you have a bigger battery pack. So you have more cost, because lithium is too much. And you also have a backup, which is preventing you from range anxiety, like you have in all electric cars. So you have an IC engine and you have a lithium battery pack. Now, depending upon what Karnataka government chooses, because for the urban drive cycle, you need series configuration for the drivetrain. The series configuration means it's the the drive is done by the electric motor, which is again driven by the battery, powered by the battery. And then when the battery gets discharged, the IC engine and regenerative braking charges your battery pack. You again charge the battery and go back on the electric motor drive. So, but in the parallel mode where you concentrate more on the, there's a smaller battery pack and bigger IC engine. You don't downsize the engine too much. That is good for the highway driving. So depending on what configuration and what application you are using the bus for, the cost drives. So if you're talking about very minimum hybridization, around 50% to 55% of the cost of the bus is only for the lithium battery pack and the electronic associated with it. So that is why if you talk about Chevy Volt, for instance, which is a series hybrid car, you have a 16 kilowatt hour battery pack, lithium battery pack, and the cost of the car is around $40,000 to $42,000, and $19,000 only for the lithium battery. And that's because you have lithium, yeah, you have lithium right $660 per kg. So each car uses 0.3 kg lithium is used for per kilowatt hour of the power. And if you're talking about 16 kilowatt hour Chevy Volt, for instance, you can imagine how much costly it's going to be. And we talk about the bus in Karnataka, then we don't have lithium in India. Everything is imported. So that is why battery pack alone is around 40 to 50 lakh. And if you compare it with a diesel bus, it's anything between 15 to 20 lakh, just the whole thing.
Yeah.
So that brings into the cost prohibitiveness. And that's where the lithium, getting away from lithium is very important, especially in the Indian context. So
now, it doesn't mean that for solar you could not use nickel metal hydride.
but there you have the rare earth, but rare earth, we don't have rare earth in India.
Yeah,
97% of rare earth is produced in China, and they repeatedly put the export regulations. So again, you go into a loop over there.
So you have to find a substitute for lanthanum, because when they say nickel metal hydride, there is 1 lanthanum to 5 nickels in that. So there is the rare earths, but it's
Yes.
the problem.
So it's
Anyway.
like 1 kg rare earth per car, so that's
Sure.
really expensive, and we don't have rare earth in India.
I think we'll let you take a break, and we also are holding everyone from tea. But I think what's been terrific today is, again, the range of the kind of technological overview that you've given us, not only in your presentation but also in the Q&A. But one of the things, and especially the last few comments that came up, you can't run away from politics as much as we want. I mean, politics always tells us you can run but you can't hide. And rare earths are actually widely available. It's just that because it's so environmentally costly to produce them, the concentration has become exceedingly concentrated in China, 95 to 97% of production. Safety issues come up, and again, safety has a political dimension. It's not just an engineering or a scientific decision. But I think one of the key points that's coming across from the feedback that we are getting from the questions, but also discussions we had a few days earlier, is that for renewable energy in India, with its kind of limited resources, to progress, some sort of a pathway, a roadmap is needed, perhaps not just on the technology side, but also on the policy side, to make some of these investments that the private sector is thinking about more feasible. That's perhaps not as optimistic a note as I started on, but it's perhaps a more realistic one that forces us to continue channeling our energies towards these areas. Professor Banerjee, thank you very much.